All right, folks, right here from the shores of the mighty and majestic Great Slave Lake in Yellowknife. Do you know Jack? On the line today with hockey goalie and analyst and now author Kelly Hrudey. How are you doing, man?
You know what? I'm fantastic. I've had the luxury or the privilege of going up to Yellowknife
That's great.
before,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's a beautiful area. I was lucky enough also to take my wife up there, and we experienced some of the hospitality. It was a real memorable trip for us.
Yeah, for sure, man. And I regret that I wasn't able to meet you in person. I've been in Yellowknife now since 2005. Although don't hold this against me, but I grew up in the Vancouver area, which makes me a Canucks fan.
Oh wow, okay,
Yeah.
gotcha.
Well, now growing up in Edmonton, did you aspire to one day play for the Oilers? Like, where was your playing head at? I think you were playing junior in the late '70s, if my stats here are correct.
Yep, that's right. So no, well, I'll go back a little bit in history. I was given the greatest gift from my mom and dad early on, although I didn't recognize it at the time.
Uh huh.
We couldn't afford much for a holiday, so every single summer, what we'd do, we had a small little camper, my mom and dad and my brother,
Uh huh.
and we'd go to Banff and Jasper, and we'd spend a week out there. And that, to me, was the gift that they gave me, a love for the mountains. And so at that point growing up, I don't know, I might have been 12 or 14, something like that. That's when I really started thinking that at one point, maybe, hopefully I can make a career by being a park warden in one of the national parks.
Oh
And
wow.
that was my lifelong ambition. And unfortunately, hockey got in the way. And so, like I said, or like you said, late 70s, I moved away to go play for the Medicine Hat Tigers. And after my second year, I was drafted by the Islanders. And so that sort of 2 years, I guess, kind of changed the course of my life, and I ended up playing pro 17 years, two in the minors and 15 in the NHL. And then I was lucky enough to move on to have a broadcasting career on the greatest hockey show in the world, Hockey Night in Canada. So to say that I've been very fortunate for basically the last 40 years would be an understatement.
Well, and now you're fortunate enough to have a book out. It's called Calling the Shots, Ups and Downs and Rebounds, My Life in the Great Game of Hockey. It came out October 24th of 2017, I guess,
Yeah.
on HarperCollins. I mean, why now? Why the book now, Kelly?
Well, Jack, that's a great question, and that's one that I get often from people because basically the stories are timeless. There's
Yeah.
mostly hockey stories I share from my time playing and so on, and I guess to a certain degree they could have been told 20 years ago when I first retired, and I've been offered some publishing deals back then, but I just didn't think the time was right, and I'm really glad that I waited because time gives you, I think, a better perspective on life, and I'm sure I would have saw some things a little bit differently. I don't know if I would have had the clarity, that kind of stuff. So now that I'm, well, I'm 57. So I think I have a pretty darn good perspective on how those relationships were in my life. And because that's really what the book is all about. Kirstie and I, the co-author, and I sat down a number of times and we started sharing stories and so on. And finally, because we didn't really have a theme or we didn't have a concept yet. And so after maybe third or fourth meeting, she says, okay, I've got it. It's all about the relationships in your life because that's all you seem to talk about, or that's how you kind of tell your stories. So that's the theme. That's kind of the motivation behind it. And as much as I think I'm a pretty cheery guy, I see things pretty positively most of the time, there is a little bit of conflict in the book because you can't be in an occupation this long without having some
Yeah.
conflict. And unfortunately, it in some cases with people that I really liked, and I didn't like that it ended that way, but that's unfortunately how life kind of goes.
Yeah, well, now I was noticing that you got Kirstie McLellan Day as your your co-author as you just stated. I mean, was that planned? Was that the publisher that set it up, or how did that work?
Yeah, it was actually Kirstie and I and her husband, Larry Day. We met, oh boy, 10, 12 years ago. It was at an event in Calgary that I was the guest speaker. And I told a lot of these same stories. Maybe I didn't go quite into the great length, and she was able to get a little bit more out of me in the storytelling. And I guess at that point, that kind of sparked an interest in her about her and I at one point working together. And then she ended up writing, I think, Theo Fleury's book, Bob Probert's book, two of Ron McLean's books. So, and Wayne Gretzky's. I know there was another guy in there, but for some reason it's stalled and it hasn't been published. And then so she came to me, oh boy, I'm going to say 2-3 years ago, and really pitched the idea. And we started meeting, and it sort of came together. And yeah, so it was her idea, and I'm glad she chose me because she's a wonderful author. And so we've had a fantastic relationship, both professionally writing the book and getting to know each other a little bit more.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I know, that you've just, self-described your book is not necessarily a tell-all, and I think perhaps,
right.
At this point, because you've waited so long, you've got this sort of nostalgic, whimsical kind of take on things at this point. And I mean, I guess, through those ups and downs, if you can't sit back and maybe laugh about them a little bit, then what can you do at this point, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And, the thing is that I think you can tell from my tone that I'm pretty hard on myself. So the guy that I think takes it the hardest in the book is me. I mean, I'm pretty honest about myself. And that's getting back to that about the time and gives you a better perspective. There were a couple of stories in there that personal things that I went through that I wouldn't have felt comfortable sharing 20 years ago. But now I'm a lot brighter. I have a better perspective on, say, mental health issues. And so for me, I'm not as afraid to share a couple of things that even my wife didn't know that I went through. And so it was really kind of cathartic, I think, to get some of this off my chest also. And that I'm not talking about any of the conflict. I'm talking about some of my personal things.
Yeah. Well, and that's very admirable to step forward and because, I mean, let's face it, you've played on world-class teams throughout your career, and you've, for lack of a better word, I mean, maybe you would disagree because, like you said, you're hard on yourself, but I mean, you were a world-class goalie at one point too, and here you're at the height of your career, and you're having these, these mental health struggles, and it's great to hear that Barry stepped in with the help of Tony Robbins, which seems like an odd pairing, but I mean, it's awesome to hear that Tony was I guess, for lack of a better word, legit, right? Because I mean, what a lot of us might remember from that time period is the infomercials and stuff. But I mean, there was a method to the way he did things, which is awesome.
Yeah, and in fairness to Tony, I think because it was all new to us, right? We really didn't know, or we didn't share much about our own psychology. We certainly didn't know or have sports psychologists at that time, or if they were around, they were only kind of on the periphery. They weren't really involved in the team aspect. So we were watching Tony, and Jack, you talked about watching the infomercials. I had watched them well before I met him. And then my first thought was, when I sat in the room, was, okay, we're going to start working together here. Is he legit? And the thing is, he immediately, once we started to work together, and I immediately knew he knows exactly what he's talking about. I'm lucky because he's going to help me. He's in my corner. And so I was at a point in my life that I knew I needed help. I couldn't dig myself out of this ditch by myself. And so the help came at the right time. And I guess Barry and Tony both say, just looking at my body language, it changed almost immediately when I started to think more about the positives and think more about myself as a general out there, not so much as a weak person. And so that really changed my life at that point. And I was able to, I still had some hard times, there's no question, but I was able to do it with more of a belief and a strength system.
Yeah. Well, and what's cool about this too is, Barry had the presence of mind to know that maybe, you needed to reach out to someone instead of that age-old kind of stereotype that, Kelly's just a goalie. He'll get over this. Like, goalies are supposed to be eccentric and blah, blah, blah,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's no question. And the other thing which really surprised me, and I always thank Barry every time I see him, I'm forever grateful for what he did and how he resurrected my career. I ended up playing another 5 years, but for Barry at that time to notice how weak I was, and not only just maybe give up on me or let me suffer and they'll go find a new goalie, he went way out on a limb back in 1992, 93 to find me some help. I mean, I don't know many hockey people back then would have had the wherewithal or the presence to understand what I was going through and to find somebody for me to talk to and get back on track. It's a really remarkable story, if you ask me. Now I think it's more commonplace, and it's really interesting because, Jack, I'm sure you've heard the stories about how my daughter shares a lot of her struggles publicly, and I get a lot of NHL people, whether it's executives, coaches, so on, talking to me about their own personal situation, whether somebody in their family might be suffering, and now I'm getting coaches really thinking about, like Mike Babcock started an initiative earlier this year, and the great thing about Mike is that he's open to different ideas as well. And we started tossing out the numbers, and the Canadian Mental Health Association will tell you it's something like 1 in 5 suffers, Canadians. I say that's under reported. I think it's far greater than that, but that's a separate topic. But anyways, if you just go on those numbers, that would tell you if you're the coach of a hockey team, it doesn't matter if National Hockey League, you could be coaching a Pee-wee team or a midget team in Yellowknife or something, boys, girls, it doesn't matter. If you have a team of, say, 20 people, you have to look at that dressing room and go, you know what? I bet there's 4, 5, 6 people in this dressing room that are suffering in some sort of way. So it's changing the attitude of coaches. I think it opens your mind to what maybe some of your players are going through, and that includes NHL teams. So I find the process and what's happening, the talk. I mean, Michael Landsberg, Clara Hughes, they all do such a wonderful job with Bell Let's Talk, and that's such a great day. Yeah, coming up January 31st, by the way. So
there you go.
That's one I support. Yeah,
mark that on your calendar.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked a little bit about Barry, but I mean, you, as you said earlier in the interview, you got drafted by the New York Islanders. And, one thing that I've noticed about that era and time that you were drafted is here's a team, obviously, that's on the rise, of course, because they went on to have those amazing, dynasty squads. But they seem to be a team that almost knew how to develop goalies, right? Because, I mean, they had Billy Smith, Chico Resch, and of course, Roland Melanson. He was no slouch, and even at one time, Richard Brodeur was sort of in the system as well. There's 4 solid goalies, and then of course yourself. I mean, was there any secret to how that team developed goalies, or was that just something that happens sort of as a coincidence?
Well, first of all, the one thing about that organization I was to learn is that they really believed in having great depth, and depth at all positions. So you look at that Islander team when I was drafted. They had just won their first Stanley Cup when I was drafted, ultimately won 4, and I made them after they won their 4th Stanley Cup. They were a team that they were so deep. When I went down to the minors in their farm system, not only were the Islanders winning at the NHL, but we were winning the 2 championships in the minors. So that's what I'm talking about. When you mention all those goalies, they also had another guy by the name of Jim Park that was a longtime WHA goalie. So when I was drafted, I believe I was number 6 on the pecking order. And so that's a long way to climb up to finally get to play for the National Hockey League team that you're drafted by. So you look at the other depth positions, they were so deep. And I don't know if it's specifically Jimmy Devellano that drafted all the goaltenders, but he was certainly the guy that drafted me, and he was the guy that sort of my conduit when I went back as a junior one more year after getting drafted. He would come visit me in Medicine Hat, and same in Indianapolis in the minors. He was the guy that he was the general manager for the Indianapolis Checkers, and so he'd make many trips to Indianapolis and check up on us. So great memories, great staff. They really were a really great organization to work for. And I guess because it was my first organization, I was spoiled because they were so successful. And so I was brought up properly, so to speak, in that environment.
In your opinion, are they perhaps the greatest team in the history of the NHL. I mean, 5 straight Stanley Cup appearances consecutively, and even in the late '70s, if the puck would have bounced a different way on a few different occasions in a few different games, they might have been in the finals a few years there too.
Yeah, they'd have to be in the running. They'd have to be in the conversation. I know the Montreal Canadiens, that just prior to that, they'd won 5 consecutive Stanley Cups, so they have to be in the mix. I think Montreal, Jack, and if my memory serves me correctly, I believe they may have only lost 7 games one season. So, I mean, you think of that. Recently, the Edmonton Oilers, they were voted as having the best team ever. Was that the 84-85 season, I think, or 85-86, something like that. So yeah. There would be there'd be a handful of really worthy candidates, but certainly the Islanders of that stretch would be in that mix, no question.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I think I've read before, it might have been Mike Bossy that said this about how he thinks the team is sort of unfairly, for lack of I'm paraphrasing, of course, for lack of a better word, but almost like pigeonholed because of the location on Long Island. I mean, would you agree with that sentiment, or?
To a certain degree, and I think there's another thing in play that has sort of changed everything, and that's how much more media there is now. I mean, back then, I thought there was a lot of media, but certainly by not by today's standards. And then you add in social media, which has really changed the landscape of everything in terms of reporting and so on. So I think if that Islander team, if they were around today, their popularity would be much greater than it was back then.
Yeah, yeah. I was gonna say now, off the top of the interview too, we have even closer a connection than you just having traveled up to Yellowknife, because my uncle is close family friends with the parents of John McIntyre.
Oh, no way! That's cool. Yeah, John was one of my favorite players. He and I know there's a picture of John in the book, and
that's right.
Yeah, he was a real valuable centerman for us, and. That's the one thing, and I kind of got into it a tiny bit in the book, but the one thing that really sucks about playing pro hockey at times is when people move, and it happened to me. I ended up getting traded once, and I moved as a free agent one time, and I saw a lot of my friends moving as well, and that really stings, and it's really hard to accept, but you have to, because that's part of the business, but it's not a fun part, and there are many good people like John that ended up moving elsewhere. I think he went to Vancouver after he played with us, and so it's.
I think he moved to the Rangers, but he didn't get much ice time, and then he went over to the Canucks, and then he was part of that '94 run that the Canucks had when Pavel and Trevor and Kirk McLean was standing on his head for that entire playoff series as well. So you can tell I'm a lifelong Canucks fan there.
Well, going back to the time with the Canucks as well, we beat them in the second round of the '93 playoffs, and I thought that was our best round. Wayne Gretzky disagrees with me. He thought our third round series versus Toronto we played better hockey. I thought it was Vancouver, because that was a team built like ours, with all the guys that you mentioned, and they had Courtnall, they had all these unbelievable guys. So the next year when the Canucks ended up in the finals versus Rangers, I wasn't surprised at all. I thought they were a fantastic hockey team.
I was at the Coliseum when Pavel scored his first 2 NHL goals, which was actually against the Los Angeles Kings. You weren't in net though, so you don't have that dubious distinction.
Well, I was going to say to that point, Jack, I was at the Pacific Coliseum on about 300 occasions when Pavel scored, and they were all on me. So. Yeah, he was so hard to play against. He was one of the most dangerous guys I've ever had to face.
What struck me about that game, just thinking back, is, I mean, the Russian Rocket was such an ideal nickname for him, because he was literally just skating circles around everyone. Of course, he was completely in his prime at that point. So, I mean, there you go.
Yeah. Well, he played such a different kind of game too. He had such a unique skill set with the skating and the stick handling and the accurate shot. So. Yeah, he was certainly a guy that, to a certain degree, kind of changed the development of the game.
Yeah, yeah. Well, now speaking of the development of the game, towards the end of your book, you talk about how essentially, goaltending has evolved over time because, when you would have started, even in the late 70s, like, going down and doing any kind of butterfly maneuver, you might have risked not being drafted potentially. I know, speaking with Gilles Greton, he was telling me a few months back that they were specifically told, do not go down, you will not get drafted. So they had to learn this stand-up style. But you were kind of in that transitional game where some guys were starting to do the butterfly. But I mean, this whole style that Patrick Waugh and Martin Brodeur sort of developed over time, it was all the same goalie coach, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, well, the evolution of it was really in the 80s, because you're right, to Gilles Greton's point. I remember maybe my second year on the Islanders, and I went down on this one play in practice, and Al Arbor was so mad at me, and he basically told me not to ever leave my feet again. But the play I'm talking about is the paddle down, and I really felt that it was a move that I could sort of improve upon and get it to really refine it. And I was stubborn enough, because I believed in it, that I continued to try using it. In fact, the first time I tried it in a game, they scored on me. So Al was even more angry at me for trying it, but I knew it would work. And ultimately, it was a move that Ron McLean credits me for being the first ever to try it.
Wow.
And to perfect it. And so I'm really proud of that. And so that was part of the evolution. But getting to your point also about back then, I mean, the shots hurt. The shots don't hurt goalies anymore, or very rarely. I mean, we were so banged up. I remember after my first or second year playing junior hockey, it would have been my first year, because it was in Billings, and an NHL scout came up to me, said after the game, he said, "Son, like, Kelly, I like your game, but you look kind of scared of the puck sometimes." And I freely admit, I said, "Yeah, it hurts." I mean, I didn't know what else to say, and so he kind of chuckled at it. But I mean, that's the fact of playing goal back then. It wasn't quite the same as it is now, where the equipment is so protective and so bulky.
Yeah, exactly. Well, listen, man, I see our time is just about coming to an end here, but, again, just to get back to it, your book, Calling the Shots, Ups, Downs, and Rebounds, My Life in the Great Game of Hockey, came out on HarperCollins, October 24th, 2017. And, there's really just so much more that we could say about this book. But I mean, I guess just to sum everything up, I mean, go out and in whatever format you enjoy books. If you are a fan of autobiographies and just sports books in general, or if you're a hardcore hockey fan, this is the book for you. There's a lot of talk in there about Al Arbor. There's talk about, Wayne, of course. There's talk about Patrick Marleau in the book. Do you still keep up with some of these guys, Kelly, just to round up the interview? Like who's, sort of in the Rolodex for guys that you might call up any given time?
Oh, yeah. Wayne and I still text often. I see Patrick every once in a while, although I try and leave him alone during the hockey season. But we do text. And so all my, Tony Granato is a great friend, and he's doing really well. He's coaching the Wisconsin Badgers hockey team. There's so many of my friends that are doing well, and guys that are getting back on track. I'm not sure, Jack, if you saw the great feature on Saturday night about one of my former teammates, Kevin Stevens, and his struggles in life. But I think he's sober for now the last 2-3 years, and scouting for Pittsburgh. So there are many uplifting stories and great people that I've met.
Awesome. Well, listen, Kelly, it's been such a privilege and an honor to just be able to talk with you today, man. I really appreciate your time, sir.
Well, thanks, Jack. Thanks for inviting me on the show and for allowing me to talk about my book and my life stories.
Right on. You have a good day.
You too, bud. Thanks.
Bye-bye.